Hello good people of the Griddle Grids, I'm Mr. Spork and these are Mr. Spork's hands. I've been making a lot of crumpets lately. The backstory here is that years ago I lived in a place where just about every morning I walked past a shop that sold fresh crumpets, hot off their griddle. You'd get them morning, noon, lunch, tea time, whenever you wanted one. You'd take the beautiful little cakes, they have lots of little holes on the top of them, put some butter in there, it'd melt into the holes, put a little bit of extra marmalade on top. It was pure heaven. Lovely little things, but that's been a while. So I got the urge for a crumpet the other day, went and pulled out the recipe that I learned from that very same shop, and decided to tweak it and show it to you guys here today. The idea behind a crumpet, if you've never had one before, I know in North America the griddle cake of choice is the instant gratification pancake, and they are lovely right out of the pan, but the staying power of a pancake isn't very good. In other words, if you've ever tried to reheat a pancake on the next day, it's not a pleasant affair. With crumpets, where the clever Anglo-Saxons invented them, the references go back to the 1300s, but I suspect a batter with yeast put on a hot rock was done years and years and years earlier. The idea is that the yeast in the mix gives them some more durability and some staying power. So when you go and take an extra hour on a lazy weekend morning to make crumpets, you make the whole batch, you eat a few of them warm, if you can avoid eating all of them, and you put the rest into a plastic bag, and for the rest of the week, all you need to do is take one, pop it in the toaster to refresh it, start making your cup of tea, and before the tea is ready, you're out the door with a warm crumpet. Wonderful things, easy to do, and everybody should make a batch of these if you've never tried them before. The first thing that stops people from making crumpets, actually, is this concept that you have to have a ring. And while a ring is traditional, you put it on, the crumpet stays restrained in there, and it rises more. You get a taller crumpet that way. You don't absolutely have to have the rings, although I quite like using them. I tried with this metal ring, and metal rings are rather traditional, but quite honestly, this thing gets insanely hot. Just ask my scorched fingers. So what I started using were these silicone rings. If you need to find these, go up to my website. I've got some links for shopping there, but these are generally called egg rings when you go hunting for them online. Why everybody has an obsession with perfectly round breakfast food, I don't know, but they work really well. And in fact, I think in my tests, the silicone ring released better than the metal ring. What you do is you take an oiled finger and you go around with the edge and just grease it lightly, and it will release perfectly well. You do that on the metal rings as well, but even side by side with the same amount of lubrication, shall we say, the metal rings didn't release as well. So I recommend the silicone ones if you get the chance. For ingredients here, somebody commented on one of my videos the other day that they couldn't tell what the white powders were, the different white powders were. So for you guys, I went ahead and put labels on it and even put them in different shape containers. How handy is that? Anyway, what you need for this recipe is you're going to need some baking soda, some yeast, that's the fast-acting rapid rise yeast that I'm using here, a little bit of ordinary salt and ordinary sugar. You're going to need some warm milk, and I'll explain that in a little bit. You're going to need some hot water, and you're going to need some all-purpose flour. Now, for those of you that regularly watch and read my website, you'll know that up here in Canada we use hard Canadian wheat, so our flour has ever so slightly more protein compared to other places in the world. What you might need to do with your local supply, and do try it with your own supply first before you worry about it, but what you might need to do if you're not getting the structure that you really like, substitute out maybe 20 or 30% all-purpose for strong flour, or what's called bread flour. The higher protein, higher gluten content flours will give you a little bit more structure. That's the list. I'm going to clear the decks a bit and we'll get started. There are, of course, lots of different historical interpretations of this idea of a hot risen griddle cake. The term pikelet gets thrown around a lot in Anglo-Saxon circles for something that's very similar, and the good people of Scotland call something a crumpet, but theirs is a little bit closer to a pancake, a little bit thinner and cooked in a little bit different way. The term crumpet itself is actually a leftover from the Welsh language, and as lovely as the people of Wales might be, I can't make heads or tails of their language, so I'm going to leave the etymology to somebody else there. The inevitable comparison, however, is going to be between crumpets and English muffins, and as far as I can tell, the main difference is that crumpets use some kind of milk or dairy in the mix, whereas English muffins are all water. But what I'm going to do here is a mix, so it really will be a crumpet, and one of the clever things that they do up here in Canada with the dairy industry, despite being a little bit mad for price fixing, is that on all of our dairy, we label the percentage of milk fat. right? So if you remember that regular milk is about 3.25%, and then cream comes at 5 and 10 and 18%, what you're aiming for in the mix here is a total of 300 milliliters. And if you've only got regular milk around, I'm going to say use 150 milliliters of hot water and 150 milliliters of regular milk. But because I don't stock regular milk and I prefer cream, I've got about 100 milliliters of 10% cream here. I've done this with 50 milliliters of heavy cream, or 18% cream, I should say. And then the rest of my 300 milliliters is hot water. Now, because we're working with yeast here, we want to make sure that the temperature is something the yeast can stand. If it's too hot, then you're going to want to let it cool down. This is a little bit cool, so what I'm going to do is go into the microwave and get this up to around 115, 120 degrees before I put the yeast in. After a quick stint in the microwave, you can see that we are now at a much more yeast-friendly temperature, 118 degrees. That'll be just about perfect for getting the most out of our yeast. Got my handy-dandy 1 teaspoon measure for you following along at home, and I'm going to go in with some sugar. This is just ordinary white sugar. And then I'm going to go in with my fast-acting yeast, and I'm actually going to give it a really healthy, maybe 1.5 teaspoons actually. You could probably even go teaspoons if it's a cold morning like it is here. Leave the salt and the soda out for later, but we're going to give this a good whisk to get it blended well. And then, I already smell that yeast activating. Then we're going to cover it up so that extra things, bugs and cat paws and things don't fall into it. Cover it up. I'll be back in 10 minutes to show you what it looks like. So after 10 minutes of fighting with the coffee maker or tea kettle in the background, you can see the yeast is nice and happy and foamy. You really do want to proceed with the recipe as soon as you see that foam appear because you want the yeast at its most active. It's time to get the flour into the party, and I always recommend getting your scale out because it's worth it to be accurate. And we're going to go in with 250 grams of our flour. I'm sifting mine in just because that's what was out on the counter, but don't worry if you don't have a sifter. 250 grams right there. We're good to go. And we're going to take our salt and go in with that. This is just a not particularly full teaspoon of your salt. I use good fine sea salt there. And here's where you really want to work a little bit, because what we're trying to do is, again, build gluten, just like most baking. So really give it a good workout. I've switched from the whisk into my trusty old spurtle. There's a term for you food types to Google. Look up spurtle. Everybody's got a spurtle, they just don't know it's called that. But what I'm doing here is, again, really working this, I don't know if I'd call it a dough or a batter or somewhere in between, but you really want to get it going to get that gluten started, gluten structure started. And I think that is probably pretty good right there. Just take my plastic spatula to clean the decks a little bit. And what we want to do here is, again, cover the mix, and we're going to let it rise. Now this is the longer rise. We're going to go probably anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes, depending on how warm it is in your kitchen. I'll show you what it looks like in about that time. After a little more than an hour, where you either went back to sleep on a lazy weekend morning or you got really industrious and watched my orange marmalade video down below and have a batch of that cooling on the countertop, the yeast have done their work. How is that for a beautifully risen batter meets dough? Here is where you have to decide if you're going to use the rings or if you're going to go freeform. Either way will work. The rings will give you a taller crumpet, but the freeform method, where you just put it in the pan like a pancake, will also give you that unique crumpet texture and taste. The difference in the method is whether or not you use a lot of water or a little water. This is 75 milliliters, about 5 tablespoons of water, or 1.5 tablespoons of water, which is about 25 milliliters of water. Whichever one you choose, the smaller amount of water for freeform or the larger amount of water for rings will work. I'm going to use the rings today, so into my water I'm going to take my baking soda, bicarb of soda for you folks in the UK, and I'm going to put in 2 good teaspoons there. Stir this up until it dissolves well. And then into my batter, right on top of that beautifully risen batter we go. And I get out my spurtle again and I give it one more really good stir. Incorporate all that liquid. It's going to seem a little soupy at this point. Don't worry about that. You might have to employ your plastic spatula to get it well incorporated. While this final rise happens, which will take about 30 minutes or so, you want to go ahead and get your pan ready. I use a non-stick pan. You can use a regular pan with some non-stick spray or oil, but curiously enough, I get better results. Remember, we're cooking at a pretty low temperature. It's not as hot a pan as you would with, say, pancakes, and so my non-stick seems to work perfectly well without any extra grease or butter. You're going to want to play around with that in your own kitchen because the equipment's going to make the difference in the setup there. But that needs just about 30 more minutes of rest and we'll be ready to fry these off. I want to show you a couple of time lapses here so you can see how the top of the crumpet looks as it finishes. Cooking these is pretty straightforward, and if there's any trick, it's to get the heat just right so the bottoms don't get too brown before the rest is cooked through. That might take sacrificing the first few, experimenting until you get the perfect temperature. I aim for a ringed crumpet to cook in about 5 minutes, or a freeform thinner version in about a minute less, and I find that a timer is really useful here. For my 4-inch rings, I'm using about 80 milliliters of batter. That's about 1/3 of a cup for you folks down in America, but adjust your amount depending on your setup. I even saw everybody's favorite shouty chef, Gordon Ramsay, make a giant crumpet once using the entire bottom of a small pan, like a 6 or 7-inch pan, which you could easily do too if you happen to have a giant coming for brunch. As you can see, the bubbles come to the top and then burst, and as the crumpet cooks, those holes will begin to stick around instead of filling in. The edges, of course, will dry out first. With about a minute, the rings will release, and then you can pull them off. If you don't own enough rings to cook the whole batch, you'll probably want a kitchen elf on standby to take them over to the sink for a quick rinse so the next crumpet doesn't stick to any leftover crumpet smudge. With the freeform, it's just the same process as you can see, but put a bit of the chosen measure of batter in the pan first, let it set for just a few seconds, 5 or 6 seconds, and then put the rest of the measure on top so that the heat has a chance to kind of set the shape of the bottom a little bit better. Other than that, just set your timer a little shorter to account for them being thinner. After just a bit more work in the pan, I got the rest of the crumpets cooked off. The recipe will make you anywhere from 8 to 10, but clever viewers will notice that there's decidedly fewer than 8 here because I have 0 willpower, and they just taste that good. The bottoms turned out perfectly well. When you get that temperature right, that's what you're looking for. The recipe is out on my blog if you want to go check it out. The link up there in the corner will take you there. The big debate in crumpet making circles is how do you finish cooking the crumpet at the very end in the last 30 seconds. As you see in the time lapse, I do a quick 10-second flip. Some people steam them like I did on this one over here. They put a lid over the pan and finish it cooking that way. Some people turn on the broiler, but you can go read all about those options up there in the corner. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel because that will keep you in all my updates on crumpets and orange marmalade and everything else, and I do appreciate it. I love when you guys like and thumbs up and Insta, Snap, Chipper, and all that other stuff you do online. Social media kind of befuddles me, but I trust you guys will do the right thing. I've got my orange marmalade at the ready. I've got some warm crumpets left over behind the scenes. I'm going to go make some tea. Appreciate you watching as always. We'll see you next time. Cheers.